Okay, well, about a week ago, I recorded a debate with Sha'el Ben Ephraim, and it quickly became one of my most listened to and most commented on podcasts. There are hundreds and hundreds of comments, both racking up on YouTube and other social media platforms. And I have received, really 20, 30, 40 phone calls and texts from friends of mine opining and commenting on the various nature of that debate. Um, like normally happens, some people thought I was too left wing, some people thought I was too right wing, some people thought I didn't push back enough. And I just wanted to say before getting into some further thoughts on the podcast, I really appreciate the feedback. And I don't really care whether or not that feedback is, I really enjoyed this, or here are three things that you did completely wrong and I wish you did better. I really do appreciate the engagement. So please keep on coming my way with, any and all feedback, both positive and negative / constructive. I did want to take some time to shed a little bit of light on my wider arguments, because a lot of people were surprised at how much leeway I was willing to give certain strong criticism of Israel, including the idea that the IDF is committing war crimes, including the idea that there have been extremely unethical things done by the IDF in Gaza. And at the same time, why I am still to this day a, obvious strong supporter of Israel, obviously a Zionist, and even would continuously defend Israel's general war with Gaza as just. And what I want to try to argue over the next 10 or so minutes is that that is not a contradiction in terms at all. And understand this, I think, is clear to really being able to tease out the ethics of much more complex issues. And so, if you stay listening for the next 10 minutes, I can almost guarantee you I am going to say something that is going to upset you, regardless of what vantage point you are coming from. But before I do that, I wanted to go through a little bit of a digression / introduction and introduce a statistical theorem to try to eventually parse out why I reflect morally on Israel the way that I do. And that theory or theorem is called Bayes' theorem. And Bayes' theorem generally accounts for, and I promise this is going to be relevant in about 5 minutes, so please do not turn this podcast off. This is going to be interesting at the end. Bayes' theorem is a theory that says in order to truly understand any statistics, or I'm eventually going to extrapolate to any wider situation in society or morality, one needs to understand base rate. So let me give you an example. If somebody is trying to raise money for developing a new drug, or if two different labs are both applying to governmental grants and they're both trying to make their pitch as to why their drug that they're researching and the disease that they are trying to cure is more important, and somebody gives you these statistics. So you can take a second, if you remember back to, I don't know, high school or college math class or logic class, you can, even pause this podcast and write this down as we're going. Disease A that lab A, say, is working on treating, that kills 90% of people that get infected with disease A. So if you get it, 90% chance you're going to die. Disease B, on the other hand, kills 10% of people that get infected with disease B. So if you get disease B, there is a 1 in 10 chance you're going to die. And so we can start off by asking the question, which disease is worse, which is more dangerous for society, which should the government invest more federal grant dollars in trying to cure? And if you know no other information, you would say, well, obviously disease A is much worse because it kills 90% of people. But what Bayes' theorem teaches, and why this is a crucial thing to understand when analyzing any statistics, and also it's crucial to understand in ways that statistics are actually used unfairly in arguments, and you can kind of play with statistics and use them in whichever way you want, because the mature question that one should ask if somebody asks you what is generally worse for society, disease A or disease B, is you have to ask, what are the base rates, or what are the prevalence of disease A versus disease B in society? Let's say disease A is super rare. 1 out of a million people get disease A. So, okay, 1 out of a million people that get disease A, 90% of 1 out of every a million people will die if we don't treat disease A. But say disease B, say that's super common. That's ubiquitous. That infects 20% of American citizens have disease B. Even though disease B only kills 10% of people, if we're talking about 10% of 20% of the population, that is a massive number. That's hundreds of thousands of numbers of people. And so just from understanding the base rates, you can understand that if somebody asks you in the abstract, here is disease A that kills 90% of people, here is disease B that kills 10% of people, which is worse? If you don't ask the further question, which is, what are the base rates? What are the priors? You actually don't understand anything. And if I am a lobbyist group for treatments for disease A, I can plaster all over all of my billboards. Disease A kills 90% of people that infect it. It is super dangerous. It is super potent. We need to cure this now. You, as now the smart statistical observer, due to the fact that you listen to this podcast, of course, you are now going to start to ask yourself, well, what are the base rates? What are they not telling me? What do I actually need to know that is prior to somebody presenting me with these statistics? I'll give you one more statistical example, then we'll slowly mold into how this affects my thinking of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Let's say we're talking about a type of cancer, right? Let's say not a super common one. Let's say we're talking about a type of cancer that 1% of the population has, right? So let's say, you just accept as a premise, 1% of citizens will get X type of cancer, right? And let's say this cancer is, pretty bad, pretty deadly. You don't want to get this cancer. And so we institute, and the National Health Organization says, every single person in America should get a screening for this type of cancer. And the screening is pretty good. The screening will, 90% of the time, the screening will properly catch if you have cancer, and it has a 10% what one calls a false positive rate. So 10% of people who take this test, it will ring as a positive even though they don't have cancer. So again, just to go over the statistics, 1% of people have a certain type of cancer, and everybody in America is taking this test, so that's 100% of people, and 10% of those people that are actually getting this test, it will show that they are positive for cancer, but they won't actually have cancer. So let's say I then sign up to get this screening and I show up as positive. I have cancer. Initially, I'm going to freak out. Oh my goodness, I just tested positive for cancer. I have cancer. But if you actually consider the statistics, and if you don't trust me, you can type this into Google or ChatGPT or, your favorite statistical method of sorts, and you find out you actually only have about a 9% chance of having cancer, given the prevalence of the base rates are 99% of people start off not having cancer. So even if only 10% of people have false positive rates, if you test positive for cancer, the chances are still you don't have cancer because of those prior base rates of most people don't have cancer. This is super important to understanding not just statistics, but I would argue anything in our society that has to do with ethics and morals in general, right? Let's start to creep into the realm of morality. I mentioned last time in the podcast debate, there's lots to say about the overall ethics of things like the bombing of Dresden in World War II, right? And zoomed in, and if we talk about just the individual acts, it is unethical to indiscriminately drop bombs on civilian areas like what happened in World War II. I'll give other examples, right? It is unethical to, say, take rats and inject them with various diseases in a lab. It is unethical. I'll give another example from the field of law and society. It is unethical in some way to have somebody who you're almost 100% sure this person is a serial sexual assaultist or a murderer or a thief, and to let that person go free and to not put them in jail. Those are all true statements. But then let's try to unpack what I will consider the base rate morality. Well, World War II, the most important goal was stopping the Nazis. So when you consider the bombing of Dresden within the moral context of the prior or the base rates of the most important thing right now is stopping the Nazis, and then, yes, there are unethical things that the Allied powers did in World War II, and we could say, that's bad, just the same way that in my first example, if you get disease A, that has a 90% death rate, right? That's really bad. That still sucks for that 1 in a million person. But if you zoom out, you realize that's not the main point of what we're talking about here, right? The main point of what we're talking about in the context of World War II is how important it is to stop Nazi ideology. Same thing with things like animal testing for drugs. It is unethical in a vacuum to get a bunch of rats, put them in a bunch of cages, and to inject them all with different types of cancer. But yet, when you extrapolate and consider the wider context / priors of what you're doing, and you say, well, this animal treatment is actually going to lead to saving hundreds, thousands, 10,000s, maybe even hundreds of thousands of lives in the future, all of a sudden that immoral action, it's not that the action becomes moral, it's just the ends justify the means, right? The ends of saving this disease actually do justify immoral actions along the way. Now, it doesn't mean those actions need to be defended. You can still say it is inherently immoral, and I would agree, to inject a rat with type 2 diabetes or anything like that. And yet I would still defend it within a wider context, right? Same thing with the idea that occasionally within our justice system, criminals go free. We have a base rate prior baseline moral idea of our judicial system where every single person has the right to a due process and an attorney, which means almost every single day there are people who everybody's almost 100% sure they are guilty of murder, of rape, of other things, and yet they are given by our taxpayer money, lawyers, that work endlessly to try to defend them and to try to get evidence thrown out, and occasionally this works. And so one could say, well, it is immoral if somebody that should be in jail goes free, but yet most of us, at least in liberal society, would take a step back and we would say, okay, yes, but within the wider context of liberalism and the right to a fair trial and the right to be represented and the right to due process and everything like that, that baseline moral scenario is actually worth having a couple of these immorality things happen along the way. This is the exact way that I think about the conflict between Israel and Hamas. Let me explain. I don't make any gripes about it. This is not my nuanced position. I'll enter the nuance in a second, but I think it's pretty black and white that Israel is the good guy and Hamas is the bad guy. One society, aka Israel, is rooted in the ideas of liberalism, of democracy, of equality, not just of religions and ethnicities, but also for gender, also for diverse expressions of religiosity. There's no heresy laws in Israel. There's no laws banning women from representing public office. You know, the list goes down and down and down. All it takes is open up the Israeli Declaration of Independence and read through some of the core values that, according to Israel's own words, it says it has. On the other hand, let's do the exact same thing for Hamas. Don't even take what pro-Israel people say about Hamas. Take what Hamas says about themselves. You can do the same thing for Hezbollah and the Houthis and the Iranian government and the like. Read, if you haven't done it yet, pause this podcast and go read the 1987 original Hamas charter, where Hamas talks about how the Jews are the problem of all of the world's ills and woes, and if there's financial collapse, it's the fault of the Jews, and the Jews caused World War I, and the Jews actually even caused World War II because they wanted to enrich themselves, and that it's the role, according to the Hamas, of all Muslims to just hunt down every last Jew. Or we can talk about the Houthis that, you know, constantly say death to America, death to Israel. We could talk about how these cultures glorify murder and martyrdom, and the pinnacle of what success means in a society like Hamas's is not to grow up, to raise a nice family, to, you know, better the world in, you know, our small ways that we can, like the dominant Israel view is. It is actually to be a martyr, to martyr your oneself for this cause. And what they mean by martyrdom is actually going out and killing Jews. And if you die along the way, well, all the better, right? This is a very black and white situation that Israel quite literally is fighting with a death cult like Hamas in a battle that by definition is going to be asymmetrical, because one country, Israel, is trying to not just protect its own soldiers and own civilians' lives. Israel is, as crazy as this to sound, it is true, you can look this up, Israel takes pains to protect the lives of Gazan civilians. There's been a lot written about this. This is not the time for me to argue this now. I'm just telling you how I am thinking of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now we can talk about where things start to get a little bit fuzzier once we have those base rates in mind. Once we understand the base rates, I'm happy to talk all day about the shortcomings of Israel. Israel almost certainly has committed war crimes over the last year and a half. There have been anecdotes and individual examples of IDF soldiers doing things that are absolutely despicable, and they should be prosecuted by the fullest extent of the law, and reasonable people everywhere should condemn this as, this is terrible, this should not be done, no ifs, ands, and buts. Israel also has decided in this, you know, very difficult war of Hamas intermingling itself around civilians, as I said in the debate with Sha'el, lowered the threshold for when it's willing to bomb a place. And so Israel has implicitly said they are willing to accept a higher number of civilian casualties than they were in other past wars in Gaza, say 2008, or 2014. Again, one could debate the ethics about that. This is where I think reasonable people could disagree on, is it okay? Is it moral? Is it ethical that the IDF has lowered its bar and the IDF has essentially said they are willing to accept a higher level of civilians being killed in Gaza to make sure they have a higher percentage of rooting out Hamas? And one could disagree. One could think that Israel's actions in this war have been wrong, have been on average erring on the side of immoral and despicable. Again, not my personal opinion, but that is a reasonable position to have if that is contextualized within the wider base rate of, don't forget that Israel is fighting for all the things we care about the most: liberalism, democracy, freedom, and Hamas is fighting for all of the things that are trying to bring back the world to the most debased type of medieval philosophy that has ever existed within mankind. So the base rates are that black and white. And once we understand the priors, just like base theorem says, again, the later statistics are also important. In my first example about disease A versus disease B, for the 1 out of a million people who get disease A, it's no comfort for them to be told, well, it's actually not really worth it to do research in disease A because disease B, even if it only kills 10% of people, is actually much more dangerous. They say, but I have it. And they are right to say that. In other words, they are right to argue their case and to say, well, this also seems super important, even if it goes against the general trend of the base rate. So we should be having arguments. And I think it's probably healthy for Israeli society to be having, and Jewish culture and the community to be having these internal discussions about, is IDF tactics within Gaza, how has that done on the moral scale over the last year and a half? And again, I am not going to be one to defend each and every, or even most of the actions of what Israel has done, but yet that bears no consideration when talking about just the baseline morality of these two different political or national or religious, again, the lines are blurred between all of these when talking about both Israel and Hamas, all of these background priors. One of the last, one of the examples that I gave to Shael, he did not like this example, but the more I think of this example, the more I think it actually perfectly encapsulates my feeling, is I said that, people like Shael, they are like, this situation in the medieval period where just, the little bit of background that's relevant, if this is the first podcast of mine you've listened to, is there was obviously this idea in medieval Christendom of the blood libel. So the idea that Jews had a ritual purpose for killing mostly Christian babies. Some theories is that Jews baked their matzah out of Christian baby blood. There were other rituals that just for, demonic ritual purposes, Jews had this bloodlust for Christian babies. And so I gave the hypothetical example of a medieval Jewish doctor who, let's say, was being very negligent at work and maybe even, say, showed up to work drunk, right? Which is, again, very negligent for a doctor. And in the process of trying to do drunk surgery on a Christian baby, kills the Christian baby, right? This, I think, perfectly encapsulates, again, my feelings of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think it would be unreasonable if you were a Jew in that community to issue a public proclamation to the entirety of England or France or Germany or whatever this hypothetical example is taking place, and you said, Jewish doctor kills young Christian baby, right? That would be entirely unethical because when we consider, again, our base rates, our priors in the ethics of the situation, well, the base rates are Jews are existing as a debased, rightless minority within wider Christian culture that are being blamed for all the ills of society, especially the false accusation that Jews have a just inherent essentialized desire to kill Christian babies. And every time, of course, a blood libel, came onto the scene, that would follow pogroms and Jewish deaths and the rape of Jewish women and the forced conversions of local Jewish communities. And so there is a position where if you only consider the narrow case, right? Somebody only tells you you have a doctor who is being negligent that kills a Christian baby. How big of a deal is this? You would say, that's a big deal. We should do whatever we can to broadcast that in international media, blah, blah, blah. But if you consider the wider situation, I would say, well, it actually would be unreasonable. It would be unethical to broadcast that to the wider public, given the priors of what's going on. Again, it doesn't mean you don't criticize the doctor, right? It doesn't mean we can't say and we can't actually fight for that doctor to lose their license. And heck, maybe that doctor to even be thrown in jail within the ancient Jewish or medieval Jewish jail system, right? I wouldn't necessarily advocate against that. Again, you don't have to defend what the doctor is doing in that case to also defend the idea that it would be crazy to broadcast that to the public. And in my view of Israel is the exact same. Israel is doing things that I find very uncomfortable and very immoral. Yet, given the wider culture of what's going on, the fact that so much of this hyper focus and demonization of Israel is based on just a modern iteration of anti-Semitism, and this isn't a well-reasoned, well-moraled, good faith criticism of, well, it seems that, this one tactical bombing that the IDF did, it seems like they could have actually spent a little bit more time trying to figure out how to reduce collateral damage. No, 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 no. The vast majority of anti-Zionists are people that are just taking the, USB or the cassette tape of anti-Semitism straight out of 1920s and rebooting this into a 21st century version and saying, well, Jews just have a bloodlust of killing Palestinian children, and Jews are just murderous, and Jews are just trying to hypnotize the world into supporting their genocidal cause. Jews are just really white European colonialists, insert bad thing here. And so within that context, I think it is now unreasonable to spend all of your time, as people like Sha'el are doing, broadcasting to the world, well, here are actually ways that we can highlight that Israel is doing something bad. So again, just to clarify my position here, and again, I had said originally that I was going to say something to upset everybody. So apologies if I've upset you, but I did warn you if you've made it this far. It's okay to have critical conversation about really anything that you see. Again, we're humans. You're supposed to be critical of things, but just like statistics, if you fail to zoom out and understand the base rates or the priors of what you're dealing with, you're just going to end up coming up with arguments that are morally immature and that really don't make any sense when they brush against the real world. And so next time somebody shows you a flashy statistic like, look how bad disease A is, it kills 90% of people, rather than hop on the bandwagon and say, oh my goodness, I need to spend all my time trying to fight against disease A, ask the next question, which is, what is the base rate of people that actually get this disease in the first place? And then you are on the right step to becoming at least a more advanced thinker, not just of statistics and when people are trying to trick you into believing their final argument based on statistics, but also, I think, general baseline political and moral arguments as well. Thank you for listening. I hope that you, both subscribe, comment, and send this podcast around.